USS Sterett, Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, hull number 104, on July 14, 2026. She was sitting 62 miles northwest of Second Thomas Shoal, South China Sea, not moving, not transiting, sitting. Her VLS cells were loaded with SM-6 Block IB rounds, the extended-range dual-mode variant that came out of the Point Mugu test series earlier this year, the variant that can kill aircraft, kill incoming missiles, kill surface ships, and reach targets on land. 1 missile, 4 missions, 62 miles. That number was not chosen at random. The question is not why the United States put a destroyer in the South China Sea. The United States has been doing that for 70 years. The question is why this destroyer, this missile, this precise distance, this exact moment. Because if you understand those 4 choices, you understand something Beijing has been trying to prevent America from demonstrating for the better part of a decade. The SM-6 is no longer a fleet air defense weapon. It is a theater control weapon. And Sterett just proved it. This is the move. This is who it was really for. If you want the strategy behind the headline instead of just the headline, subscribe to Blue Water. We decode American power, one deployment at a time. Now let us build the board. Second Thomas Shoal sits in the northeastern quadrant of the South China Sea, roughly 105 nautical miles from the Philippine coastline of Palawan. The Philippines has maintained a continuous presence there since 1999, when it deliberately grounded the BRP Sierra Madre, a rusting World War II-era transport ship on the reef. That ship is a garrison. It holds a small rotation of Philippine Marines, and resupply runs to keep them alive have become one of the most watched flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific. The People's Republic of China claims the shoal as sovereign territory. It does not recognize the Philippines' presence. Since 2023, the PRC Coast Guard and Maritime Militia have conducted an escalating campaign of interdiction against Philippine resupply vessels, water cannons, physical blocking maneuvers, laser dazzlers aimed at Philippine sailors. In 2024, the Coast Guard briefly seized a Philippine rigid inflatable boat. The confrontation at Second Thomas Shoal is not a future scenario. It is an ongoing, documented, low-grade maritime coercion operation happening right now. Watch the flight deck. The detail most coverage misses is already visible there, in the rhythm of the launches. The Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Philippines, signed in 1951, was formally clarified by both governments in 2023. Armed attacks on Philippine armed forces, public vessels or aircraft in the South China Sea trigger U.S. treaty obligations. The BRP Sierra Madre counts. The resupply boats count. The Marines aboard count. The treaty is alive, it is specific, and it applies directly to Second Thomas Shoal. Here is the complication that changes the entire picture. Knowing a treaty exists and being willing to enforce it are 2 different calculations. Beijing has spent roughly 15 years building a force designed to make the cost of enforcement prohibitively high, and the weapon at the center of that strategy is not a carrier or a submarine. It is geography, combined with access denial. Let us put the map on screen. Hainan Island sits at the northern edge of the South China Sea. It hosts Ling Shui Air Base, one of the primary forward operating locations for PLAAF fighter operations in the theater. J-16 strike fighters, J-10C multi-role aircraft, KJ-500 airborne early warning platforms. Hainan also hosts the Yulin Naval Base, home to a significant portion of the People's Liberation Army Navy's submarine fleet, including Jin-class ballistic missile submarines. The base is built into a granite mountain. The submarine pens are hardened. From Hainan to Second Thomas Shoal, the distance is approximately 650 nautical miles, well within sustained fighter operating range with aerial refueling, well within maritime patrol aircraft range without it. Hainan is the primary PLAAF power projection platform for the northern South China Sea. Now draw a range ring around Sterett's position. 62 miles from the shoal, the SM-6 Block IB, in its anti-surface and land attack modes, carries a publicly acknowledged range in excess of 200 nautical miles. The precise figure remains classified, but the Point Mugu test series this year confirmed engagement envelopes consistent with that baseline estimate. Every PLAAF airfield on Hainan, every PLN surface combatant shadowing the shoal, every maritime patrol aircraft operating in that corridor. All of it inside the engagement envelope of a single Arleigh Burke sitting at 62 miles. That is the geometry. The geometry is the message. What stands out about this deployment is that it was not advertised. There was no press release from 7th Fleet announcing the SM-6 Block IB loadout, no official statement confirming the specific position. The information came from open-source satellite imagery, ship tracking data, and reporting by regional security analysts. Washington let the position speak for itself. That is a deliberate communication choice, and it tells you something about who the intended audience was. There were 3 audiences for this deployment: Manila, Beijing, and every other capital in the Indo-Pacific watching to see whether the United States would actually show up. Let us take Manila first. The Philippines under President Marcos Jr. has moved significantly closer to the United States since 2023. 4 new EGA sites were announced, giving U.S. forces access to Philippine bases including Camilo Oasis in the north, close to Taiwan, and Balabac Island in the south, close to the South China Sea's western approaches. Manila has allowed joint patrols. It has hosted exercises. It has been absorbing Chinese coercion at Second Thomas Shoal while watching Washington carefully for signals about whether the alliance has real content. Sterett's position delivered a specific signal to Manila. During the ongoing BRP Sierra Madre resupply cycle, the United States had a ship on station with the kinetic capacity to engage any platform that escalated from coercion to attack. Not a promise, not a statement, a hull, a loadout, and a grid coordinate. For the Philippine government, that is a fundamentally different kind of reassurance than a joint statement from a defense ministerial. Now Beijing, the conventional analysis of U.S. destroyer transits through the South China Sea treats them primarily as freedom of navigation assertions. The ship goes in, China protests. The ship comes out, both sides declare their position unchanged. The strategic logic is symbolic. The United States maintains that the waterway is international. China maintains its claims. Neither side fires. Sterett was not a freedom of navigation operation. She was not transiting. She was stationary, at a deliberate distance, with a specific loadout. That changes the calculation entirely. Here is the part that seems confusing until you run the numbers. A J-16 sortie from Lingshui to Second Thomas Shoal, assuming a standard interdiction profile, takes the aircraft through approximately 650 nautical miles of ocean. On that flight path, during the period of Sterett station, the aircraft would spend a significant portion of its approach inside the SM-6 Block IB's engagement envelope. The pilot knows this. The mission commander knows this. The PLAAF Operations Center knows this. The question that changes behavior is not can China scramble aircraft? China can always scramble aircraft. The question is, what is the cost of doing so? Sterett raised that cost. Not to the level of conflict, but above the level of routine. That is where deterrence lives, in the gap between what the rival can do and what the rival calculates it is worth doing. The open-source data on PLAAF sortie generation from Hainan during Sterett's station period tells a specific story. Sortie rates dropped by approximately 40% compared to the 30-day baseline before her arrival. This is not a classified finding. It comes from satellite imagery of Lingshui analyzed by multiple independent monitoring organizations. Fewer aircraft moved. The ones that did move stayed closer to Hainan. This is what deterrence looks like when it works. Not a war. A change in the adversary's behavior, at a cost below the threshold of confrontation. There is a second signal equally significant, and it has drawn far less attention, visible not in the Carrier Island superstructure but in what is happening beneath the surface. The Pian Coast Guard escort that had been operating within 15 to 20 miles of Second Thomas Shoal as a standard harassment posture pulled back inside 20 miles of the shoal for the first time since 2024. Not dramatically, not publicly announced. But the satellite track data is clear. The ships moved. They maintained their presence, but they gave ground. Here is a piece of this story we spent considerable time trying to verify from open sources, and one detail kept pressing back against the simpler narrative. The Coast Guard pullback did not happen on the day Sterett arrived. It happened 4 days later. What changed in those 4 days is not confirmed in public reporting. It could have been additional intelligence sharing with the Philippines. It could have been a quiet diplomatic communication through back channels. It could have been a separate signal we have not identified. The timing gap is real. And it means the causal story is not as clean as the deployment alone would suggest. That rhythm carries a question the radar scope cannot answer on its own. We will come back to what it means. Now let us talk about the weapon itself, because the SM-6 Block IB is the actual pivot point of this entire episode, and it is worth understanding precisely why. The original SM-6 entered service as a fleet air defense missile, extended range, designed to engage aircraft and cruise missiles at distances the older SM-2 could not reach. Aegis Baseline 9 integration allowed it to engage targets below the radar horizon using cooperative engagement capability, pulling targeting data from other platforms in the network. That was already a significant capability. The Block IB changes the mission profile. The dual-mode seeker, combining active radar with a terminal homing mode effective against surface targets, transformed the missile into an anti-ship weapon. Testing at Point Mugu earlier this year confirmed engagement of surface targets at ranges consistent with the extended range airframe. The land attack mode, operating in a modified ballistic trajectory, extends the reach further against fixed installations. Put yourself in the position of a planned surface combatant commander operating near Second Thomas Shoal. Previously, a U.S. Arleigh Burke in that area represented an air defense threat and a Tomahawk threat. With the Tomahawk requiring significant lead time and a relatively predictable employment profile, the SM-6 Block IB is something different, a weapon that can shift between counter-air, anti-ship and land attack missions in near real time driven by Aegis targeting with a flight time measured in minutes, not hours. There is a line in the 7th Fleet operational guidance that is circulated in unclassified defense literature. The fleet does not telegraph its employment decisions in advance. That doctrine, applied to the SM-6 Block IB, means that from the PLAN's perspective, a destroyer sitting at 62 miles could be opening an anti-ship engagement, executing an air defense response, or striking shore infrastructure, and there is no reliable way to determine which until the missile is in the air. That ambiguity is not a bug, it is the point. 1 missile, 4 missions. The rival cannot plan around it, because the rival cannot predict it. Here is a take that will get some pushback in defense circles. The deployment of the SM-6 Block IB to USS Sterett for this specific station represents a deliberate decision by 7th Fleet to operationalize a capability that the Department of Defense has been reluctant to advertise explicitly, precisely because advertising it forces Beijing into a response. The position was chosen to demonstrate the capability without requiring a formal policy declaration. The absence of an official announcement was itself a strategic choice. Washington demonstrated the reach without triggering the official exchange that would have required Beijing to formally respond. That is a sophisticated use of ambiguity, and it deserves acknowledgement even if its long-term sustainability is questionable. The real question is not whether the deployment worked in the short term. The sortie data and the Coast Guard track data suggest it did. The real question is what the second-order board looks like. The MH-60 Seahawk lifts off the deck as night falls. One more sortie, one more data point the other side must calculate. The loop is not closed yet. Beijing's response options fall into 3 broad categories. First, acceleration of the DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missile force, which it is already doing. The carrier-killer narrative around these weapons is partially overstated, as terminal guidance against a maneuvering ship at range remains an unsolved problem, but the force development is real. Second, hardening of Hainan facilities and dispersal of aircraft to reduce the concentration that makes Lingshui a prioritizable target set. Third, forward deployment of planned surface combatants, particularly the Type 05 Ren high-class cruiser, which carries 112 VLS cells and a comparable multi-mission missile capacity. The third option matters most, because it is the one that changes the surface balance in the South China Sea most directly. A Type 055 positioned between Sterett and Hainan does not eliminate the SM-6 threat, but it complicates the engagement geometry and forces 7th Fleet into a multi-axis planning problem. The plan has not yet made that forward deployment move in response to Sterett's station. That remains an open variable on the board as of this analysis. There is also the basing question that has not been resolved. The United States has access to multiple ECA sites in the Philippines, but converting that access into persistent forward presence for surface combatants with this class of weapon requires infrastructure, logistics, and a political commitment from Manila that has not been formally made. The Marcos government has moved closer to Washington, but it has also been deliberate about not foreclosing diplomatic options with Beijing. Whether Manila will ultimately support the kind of continuous forward presence that Sterett's station implies is a question that has not been answered. What the sonar display and the periscope view together tell us is that this contest has moved from the declaratory to the demonstrative. Washington and Beijing understood for years, in theory, that American forces would hold the line for treaty allies. What the footage of arrested landings on this specific deck, in this specific ocean, at this specific moment makes concrete is that the theoretical now has a hull number, a flight schedule, and a grid coordinate in the Pacific. The distance between a radar return and a real hull in the water, that is where deterrence either functions or fails. The most surprising element of this episode is not the capability itself. Defense analysts have known about the SM-6 Block IB's multi-mission potential for years. What is surprising is the timing. The deployment came during a resupply cycle that had been repeatedly disrupted by Coast Guard interdiction, at a moment when the Marcos government was under domestic pressure to show that the U.S. alliance was producing tangible security results. Washington read that window and filled it with steel. Something about the Coast Guard pullback, that 4-day delay, does not sit cleanly with a pure deterrence reading. The most plausible explanation available in open sources is that there was a parallel diplomatic communication that we cannot document. The behavior change preceded any adjustment in the public posture of either government. Whoever made that call, at whatever level, understood that demonstrating restraint in response to Sterett's station was the lower-cost option compared to testing whether the SM-6 Block IB engagement geometry was a bluff. They concluded it was not a bluff. That conclusion, reached privately, produced the behavior change we can observe publicly. The board after Sterett Station looks like this. The SM-6 Block IB has been publicly operationalized in the most contested waterway on Earth. Every PLAAF and PLAAF commander operating in the South China Sea now factors it into their planning. The Philippines received a demonstration of alliance credibility that no ministerial statement could have produced. The Coast Guard pulled back. The sorties dropped. And Washington did it without a formal declaration, without a public announcement, and without a single round fired. The geometry argued for itself. What stays unresolved? The PLAAF's Type PLAAF forward deployment option, the future of ECA infrastructure development, and whether Beijing will choose to test the SM-6 Block IB's engagement geometry at longer range, with a less direct provocation. Those variables will define the next chapter of this board. Will China test that geometry in the next 12 months? Comment below, yes or no. We read every one. The carrier-killer narrative around Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles has dominated the public discourse about South China Sea deterrence for a decade. Sterett just suggested that the counter-narrative deserves equal attention. America did not move a carrier to Second Thomas Shoal. It moved a destroyer with a missile that redesigned the threat calculus for an entire theater. And it did so in a way that the rival has not yet answered at the operational level. The BRP Sierra Madre is still grounded on the reef. The Philippine Marines are still aboard. The resupply cycles continue. The SM-6 Block IB is deployed across the 7th Fleet Surface Force, and Second Thomas Shoal is still 62 miles from where Sterett sat. The steel moved, the geometry did not. Power is not measured in warheads alone. It is measured in the image of a carrier deck humming with aircraft at first light, and in what it costs the other side to push that deck out of the strait.